Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, host of the Angelo Robles podcast and the founder at Family Office Association. Really excited about today. Former CEO of 7-Eleven and CEO and chairman of Blockbuster. The future is now. Embracing change through technology. It features Jim Keys, as mentioned, former CEO 7-Eleven and CEO and chairman of Blockbuster. Really excited to have Jim on. Jim, how are you?
Doing well, Angela. Thank you. Thank you.
And I might add, besides that very distinguished background, that we're going to get into everything from big companies, entrepreneurship, leadership, culture, adaptations, technology. We have a lot to cover. Currently transitioning to a position of executive chairman of C5 Capital Holdings, doing interesting things, accelerating investments in new space, cybersecurity, and clean energy. We'll get into some of that as well. So in the 45, 50 minutes today, we actually have a lot to cover. I think what I would like to start with is, 7-Eleven and Blockbuster, 7-Eleven still doing fine. Blockbuster we'll get to, but during their day, these were gigantic public companies. And to rise to the position that you did and your experiences under boards, a little bit, with Carl Icahn at Blockbuster, I think there's so much to discuss. So if we could start a little bit, maybe more on the 7-Eleven side and kind of what led to that. So you were a senior executive at Gulf Oil, now known as Chevron. I believe you joined Citgo Petroleum in '85, and they were actually a subsidiary of 7-Eleven. And I think people that go back to those days, which I do, definitely the 80s, like that caught me initially a little bit by surprise. Oil companies were like kings back then. They were huge. I didn't realize how big 7-Eleven was to actually, the oil company was a subsidiary of them.
It's true. And, it really is, Angelo, it's about convenience. And 7-Eleven has always morphed as literally starting as an ice house in 1927, and someone invented a refrigerator, right, in 1928. So you can imagine what that does to your business. And they morphed from selling ice to selling bread and milk and cigarettes, and then gasoline became a convenience item. So they actually acquired in about 1984. They acquired the downstream. So Citgo Petroleum was the original city service and was actually broken into two companies back in the day. And you mentioned Carl Icahn. Back then, he was making his name as a corporate raider, if you will, with Boone Pickens. Boone went after Gulf. Carl went after Texaco, if you recall. City service was kind of the fallout of some of that and was split up, and 7-Eleven bought the downstream, so the refining and marketing business, to be able to have gasoline, assured supply of gasoline for its stores.
Man, I remember back in those days. So you're bringing up some great names, obviously, titans like T. Boone Pickens and Icahn that we'll get to. And I was trying to think, because it was in my backyard in Westchester County in New York. I think the other person at that time who became a recluse a couple of years later was Ivan Botsky, if you remember him.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating to have been around some of these guys. Boone actually lived in Dallas, and I got to know him. He's a fellow member of a group called Horatio Alger. I used to joke with him. I was at the shareholder meeting in the Gulf Tower in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, probably early 1980, must have been 1983 or something like that. And he literally delivered the greed is good speech, the Gordon Gekko greed is good speech. When I saw the movie Wall Street, I said, that's Boone. I heard him do that same speech at a shareholder meeting. And anyway, the rest was history. Gulf ended up merging with Chevron. I ended up at Citgo, which was part of 7-Eleven, and had quite an adventure over a 20-year period with 7-Eleven, starting with the gasoline side of the business and working up to eventually becoming CEO.
Which I believe you became the CEO in a easy year to remember in 2000, if I have that correct?
Yeah.
So, talk us through a little bit. So you worked your way up the corporate ladder. You're now, you're the CEO. So you're answering really only to the board, who theoretically answers to the shareholders. And that brings up a whole bunch of questions on my part. One would be the frustration that now that you're not in that role, you could talk about. And that must be effectively Wall Street and the pressure of quarterly earnings. You probably have this grand vision. Here's how things should be. Here's what I would like to do. But this may not look so great for a year or 2 or 3 years. And then, oh, then I'm not going to have a job. But I do believe I have a vision for what can make this company great in a new world order kind of moving forward. But the quarterly reports in Wall Street, like, it must make you so hand-tied.
It was really challenging, but I'll tell you what, I do think the system works. And, I'll give you an example of what was even more challenging in the dynamic. One of our largest shareholders ended up being 7-Eleven Japan. See, 7-Eleven, the old Southland Corporation, was the parent company of 7-Eleven back in the 80s, did an LBO in 1987, loaded up with a lot of debt, ended up in bankruptcy in 1991. And so our largest licensee, 7-Eleven Japan, came in and helped the company reemerge from bankruptcy in 1991. Now, the Japanese had a fairly large representation on the board. So you can imagine now, in fact, you mentioned what's it like managing a board? Well, you go from having one boss your entire career to all of a sudden having 12, and then a whole host of shareholders. So it is a bit of a challenge. But what was even more challenging is the Japanese, as you probably read and know, they've got a very different time frame. They tend to be planning for the next 20 years.
Yes.
And we're planning for the next quarter, right? Well, maybe a 5-year plan, but we're really much more focused on the next quarter or the next year. And so that dynamic of really looking at the long term and yet still having to manage shareholder interest for the short term was quite a challenge. But I think it was a great learning experience. And ultimately what I took away from it was, if you're doing the right thing, ultimately for the shareholders, and if you're communicating effectively the plan, some of them will leave because some of them are only in it for the next quarter. But the right shareholders will see the long-term vision and they'll stay with you. And we had that good benefit at 7-Eleven. We struggled around with $3 and $4 a share valuations for years. And then by the time I was able to take the role of CEO, we went from literally $4 up till we sold the company to the Japanese shareholder. Ultimately, in 2005, we took the value from $4 to $40. So the shareholders ultimately rewarded us for that consistent long-term sales growth and EBITDA growth eventually.
I want to go back a little bit to the interaction with the board, and I'm going to ask a very basic question, but there's a reason behind it.
Sure.
What is the main purpose of a board?
Governance. I mean, it's, sitting on the board side now. In fact, this is the biggest challenge a lot of people have when they go from management, where you're hands-on, to a board role where you're really not, you're really in a governance role, not an operating role. So knowing that difference and understanding the difference between not trying to run the day-to-day business or second guess the day-to-day business decisions, but to keep the company on that straight line of regulatory issues, integrity, keeping them on strategic point. Those are the challenges of governance versus day-to-day management.
Given that you've dealt with boards at the highest levels at 2 gigantic public companies, and Blockbuster was at a different stage, I get it, in 2007, but you get the big picture. And now that role's reversed. What makes a good board member? What would you recommend a board member do to be an active participant and to be of value to the CEO?
Well, one is to understand that really important difference between governance and management. And, I love Carl Icahn, had a great opportunity to work with him, learned a lot from him. But Carl likes to dabble, so he would have if he was sitting here next to me, he'd have a very different definition of board role, because he sees the board role much more in a hands-on, let's help the management team, give them some solid direction, those kinds of things, as opposed to more of a governance role. So my first recommendation to boards would be to understand that difference between governance and management, hold management accountable, but stay in that governance role. The second thing that I think I've learned over the years in dealing with many boards, both as management and as board member, the critical importance of communications. It's so easy to just assume, well, the board's out there, I'll talk to him next month. Board needs to understand, and the more they know and the more they understand, particularly in a situation like Blockbuster, I was very proud of our board because they had a lot of stress from shareholders, from the dynamic. Remember the timing, 2008, financial markets melted down, tremendous amount of stress on the board with $1 billion of debt and the feeling of, personal liability as a board member. That creates a lot of tension. And the best solution for that tension is constant communications. With that communications, I was proud of the board. As I said, I think they made the right decision time after time to do the right thing rather than sometimes the easy answer.
And in terms of your successes at 7-Eleven, and the share price very simply reflects that, what was among the biggest initiatives that you and the team initiated, and how did you get the people inside of 7-Eleven to execute?
Well, you'd be surprised. 7-Eleven you don't think of as a cutting edge technology company, but the advantage that I had was the opportunity to be in a global company where we had successes of licensees around the world. 7-Eleven has operations in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and as you know, 7-Eleven Japan. The Japanese actually did a fabulous job of when they took on the license, and this is about 50 years now. The company itself is almost 90 years old. So 50 years ago, the Japanese took the license and they completely reinvented the idea of convenience with modern technology at the time. So they were able to, and if you go to Japan, I recommend going into a 7-Eleven, you'll find fresh sushi that will rival any sushi bar here in the United States. In a 7-Eleven store, and you think, my gosh, how in the world they do that? They harness the power of technology to give them data that help them better understand what's sold, literally by hour of the day.
Wow.
And to manage an infrastructure that allows for 3 times a day delivery just in time of that fresh product. So the sushi you eat at lunch was made at 3 a.m. and delivered at 9 a.m.
So in terms of, and that goes a little bit to the titling of embracing change through technology, looking back even 22 years ago when you took that role at 7-Eleven, you were embracing technology. That was a big initiative. And that reminds me what you're talking about of supply chains. And we're obviously hearing a lot of that word now, supply chains, via a variety of factors, COVID, the Far East, et cetera. And often antiquated rules and protocols on shipping, on containers. And it just it seems like a lot of bureaucracy. You're a little bit looking at it from afar now, but you were really active in it looking back a couple of decades ago. Where do you think things have fallen down a little bit on the supply chain issues?
Well, it comes back to this issue of change. And that's what the whole theme that I suggested for this talk was the idea that change is hard. People resist change naturally. And it's even more important than ever today because with technology, change is moving exponentially. And if you embrace the technology, you can be able to better meet that changing need of the consumer or changing dynamic in the industry. So supply chain is just a great example. Here in the United States, we have so many change. You've got, Walgreens with 10, 12,000 locations. 7-Eleven now is 8,000, 9,000, maybe more than that. They may have more than 10,000 themselves now. Subway, 26,000 locations. They get delivery of product maybe twice a week. Every Subway with 26,000 locations with proper use of technology and infrastructure could deliver product to Subway, every Subway store once a day, probably at a lower cost than they have today. But it does require a deep dive into that linkage between the infrastructure possibilities and the use of technology to make the best use of that infrastructure. Where a lot of companies fall down is they overuse the data. So they'll for example, Tesco came to the United States and built a chain called Fresh and Easy in California. They thought they would replace retailing or the idea of a retailer in the store by just automating everything. So they automated all of their systems and failed miserably, unfortunately, because there's that fine balance between technology as an enabler to make the retailer a better retailer and trying to take the retailer out of the equation and let technology do it by itself. Someday, maybe that'll be possible through AI. We'll have better, algorithms to support more effective decision making. But today, that person at point of sale is critically important. And if you can provide the data for them to make better decisions and be a better retailer, it's very, very powerful.
I'm still fascinated by the concept, and I worked in a couple of Fortune 500 companies back in my day. Most of that goes back over 20 years ago, so perhaps some of it is a little bit antiquated. But again, you think about the shareholders or key shareholders, the board, the CEO, the C-level executives, but then you go down from there, and a lot of people in the trenches. We keep on hearing about middle management. They're too much of an intermediary. They don't, quote unquote, really add value in today's world. And I do think, unfortunately, there is some level of truth to that. And I don't want to get people out of a job. But what I am saying is, in today's world, with a larger company, a Fortune 500 company, how does someone who went to college, is, quote unquote, we'll get to that too, so-called educated, but not directly touching the consumer in a sales role, and not necessarily the highest level of a C-level executive, they're a little bit of an in-between, and things could change rapidly. What would you recommend to them to where they're providing value and those above them know that?
So I'm gonna give it to you from two angles. One is the individual in that middle management role, and secondly from the top, because you need that middle management to be able to embrace the changes you're recommending and the strategies, et cetera. And there's a lot of resistance. It tends to be a lot of resistance sometimes at that level of management. So from the individual's perspective, I'm going to break it down into three simple things. Accepting change. Change is, at that level of management, there tends to be a stagnation and inertia that occurs because change is scary. I may eliminate my own job. That's okay. If you do that, you do such a good job of creating change that you eliminate your job, there'll be other opportunities for you. Which leads to the second factor is confidence, because a lot of fear of change just comes down to a lack of confidence. And then finally, the simplicity is my third recommendation to middle management, that we tend to overcomplicate everything. And if you can't communicate up or down in the organization, you'll fail. People aren't going to be able to implement the plans. So that combination of embracing change, having confidence to do something about it, and having simplicity and clarity in communications, I think is critical for anyone in any role within an organization. Now I'll take it from the top though. From the top, it's critical that people can understand. And my analogy that I love to use is the old sitting around a fireplace or a fire pit as a Boy Scout or a Indian guide or whatever. Remember the game called Telephone, where you whisper into someone's ear and it goes all the way around the circle and it comes back and everybody laughs because there's no resemblance to what you started out. That's management.
True.
As management, that's exactly what happens. You say, okay, here's our strategy. And then by the time it filters down through senior management, division management, line management, a store operator, who knows what's going to come out the other end? It's the same process. So my solution to that in a big company environment, or it also works in a small company, is to communicate directly to the team, the entire team. With technology today, you can do it with Zoom. We were doing it through teleconferencing 20 years ago.
Right.
But get everybody together. Sam Walton was a master at that. He had people literally coming from all over the country flying into Bentonville. So they all heard the same message, the same time, directly from him. And that works, that efficiency of communication, so that it takes the mystery out of what our strategy is, what our primary goals and objectives are, literally this week and this month.
There's lots of things to follow up on. In the essence of time, I'm just going to pick one from what you said, and that was a great answer. And that goes back a little bit to my question. It seems like a key part of it is communication. So then that relates to me, emotional intelligence, the capability of listening. And we could get into leadership and inspiring others. but let's maybe stick a little bit to communication. These are not necessarily, everything I just said is something that even in most great schools, you're probably not learning that. You may be indirectly learning by being away from home and being mashed with a lot of people, and you learn how to interact. And yes, so indirectly, but in terms of the classes, in terms of what you're being taught, probably not. So like, how could someone effectively become a better listener and a better communicator?
That's a hard thing to teach. I think business schools try to do it through a case study environment where they're forcing people to work together, because we all go through school very independently, working on our own, and we don't really want to hear what the other person has to say. So the case study is a good way to sort of emulate a real business environment where you have to collaborate, and work together. I'm a big fan of leadership development processes. There are a lot of really good firms out there that come into companies and help them with this, communications thing. Great example. I thought I was a great communicator. First time I had a leadership development team come in and they did a 360, and we all went around, my whole team went around, and this is, now keep in mind, this is with me once a week talking to the entire organization. They asked the senior management team to communicate the strategy, and I was horrified at the result. It was like, wait a minute, this is not at all what our strategy is. Not one of them could articulate it, and it was ultimately my fault. So it comes down to that ability to communicate is, not just talking, and that's what I was doing. I was doing all of the talking. I wasn't listening, and I wasn't giving them a chance to express their interpretation of the strategy as well.
I mean, I think that's a mistake we all make. I mean, I still make that, to this day, but you're correct. And when I host boot camps on whatever crypto, NFTs, on family office structures, it is tempting. Hey, I know a lot. I have a 200 slide PowerPoint, and I have multiple of them. But if I simply just read off that, or even if I try to tell stories in it, and that does help, you have to almost from the get-go, you have to interact with the audience, and that keeps them engaged, on their toes. It feels like they're being listened to, and you learn what's going to be important to them, and you adapt on the spot in terms of what you're doing. How would that relate to you, to the word leadership? And that's thrown around a lot. There's a gazillion books about leadership. I remember back in the mid 90s reading like Pat Riley, then the coach of the Knicks, and his book on leadership. And, God, I'm forgetting his name now, but the legendary figure from GE, Jack Welch,
Yeah.
and others. And I remember reading T. Boone Pickens' book and so many others. How has leadership adapted? Let me rephrase that question to what is leadership. If you want to answer it, it's fine. But how has it adapted over the decades?
We've all read hundreds of books about leadership, and there's servant leadership, and there's this kind of leadership, and there's leadership by walking around. There's all kinds of different interpretations that I've heard. The one thing I've never really heard people talk about that I think is most fundamental to leadership is this idea of change, because leadership is change. And, we're dealing with that now on a national scale with COVID. As the science learns more, and as the disease actually changes, our response has to change, and our leadership has to change to be able to respond in a different fashion. And what we said yesterday may be different from what we have to do and recommend next week. And that's, a classic example of leadership. And it's what so many leaders have a hard time doing, because they think, okay, I've already said this is the way we're going. We have to keep going that way, even if it's wrong, and sometimes, and virtually all the time, business is so dynamic and the world is so dynamic, especially today, that change happens so quickly, maybe that we have to recommend now going that way. And in order to get the whole team to go that way and do a complete 180 from what we recommended yesterday, communications comes down, as we mentioned before, it's so critical, because people won't follow. They'll say, well, I'm gonna keep going that other direction, because that's what you told me yesterday, and that's what I think is right. Even if you have a new set of dynamics and a new set of information that says we should go the other way.
I'm going to try to figure out how to phrase my question, but you've been in such significant roles at iconic companies and being an advisor in what you're doing now. I'd like to talk a little bit, and we'll transition to Blockbuster in a second, than what you're doing now. Kind of A players. So you're in a position, let's say at 7-Eleven, do you shake things up by hiring recruiters or internal sources and only A players? My problem with that, and I think, by the way, sometimes that's needed, but my problem with it is, okay, like what defines an A player? Of course we want A players, but sometimes A players don't play well in a team. Sometimes they're better off being more isolated. Sometimes they're better off being more in a sales role, but not necessarily in a leadership role or unders other them. In smaller companies, sometimes they could, even if they're successful, they could pollute the culture inside literally that office. And I know things have changed now with Zoom and all that, but what's your opinion about shuffling the deck? Could you create A players from B players currently? Do you bring in A players? What's the good and what's the bad?
So it took me probably 30 years to realize that I was probably my single biggest blind spot in leadership was personnel. And that probably more important than my CFO even, which we always tend to think your CFO, your chief operating officer, the most important jobs in the company, is that in my case, the head of human resources, because I didn't have that skill that I needed to understand the dynamic between A players, B players, C players, and how to have the right team. And I'll give you a great example. You mentioned Jack Welch earlier. One of his key guys is a head trainer at Crotonville, which was Welch's leadership academy for GE, was a guy named Ram Sharan. Do you know Ram? Or do you know the name?
No, I don't. And GE's based in Fairfield, was based in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm about 5 miles away in Weston, Connecticut, but no, and I've been here for years, but no, I did not know of him.
Ram is, he's written 100 books. He's still out there
Wow.
doing consulting and leadership development. Anyway, he came through Dallas and I asked, I thought, well, Jack at the time was, sort of the guy for leadership and, successful leadership in big companies. And I thought, I'm going to get his guy Ram and he'll help me understand what what I should be doing. Kind of a leadership development coaching thing. Meets me at the airport. First thing he says is, I want a profile of every one of your managers. And I sat there, I said, okay, I gave him, 5 minutes on my top 10 people. And he said, okay, you're going to fail. I said, gee, great, thanks. Glad I'm not paying you for this. He said, you don't have the right people in the right jobs and you don't have the guts to do anything about it. And you know what?
Yeah, this guy doesn't play around.
He didn't play around. He cut right to the down. Now, keep in mind, Jack Welch is one of these guys that said 10% of you are going every year. And I'm doing you a favor by doing that because you're not going to cut it here long term. I'm going to weed out the 10% of the weakest players and keep going. So, that's sort of the environment he came from. But he was absolutely right. And so many leaders know they don't have the right people in the right jobs. And it's not about good or bad. It's about effectiveness in that role. And even if you don't have the right person in the right job, there's a tendency to say, well, I want to give him a chance. Mary, she's great. And she's such a nice person and got a nice family. I don't want to disrupt her life. I'll leave her in that role, even though it's bad for her and bad for the organization. So yeah, that was my big learning over the years was having the right people, A players, B players, hopefully C players, you weed them out, but A players or B players in the right job are critical to the success of any enterprise.
The advice that you did receive that day, did you end up literally saying, oh my God, like he's right, and you made changes, or were they more subtle than just, everything changes?
No, I came away and said, instinctively, he's right. I did make some changes. I didn't make the sweeping changes I probably should have made. So I did some and stopped short of going as far as I could have. Now, we still had a wildly successful enterprise and, great results and, 10 years of same store sales increases. But, looking back, you think probably could have even done better with the right players in the right roles at the time.
I mean, you partially answered a question that I did have in my notes, and he sounds amazing. I'd love to read his books and have him on the show. What do you think working inside a Fortune 500 company of consultancies? We got the big brands like Bain and McKinsey. Companies hire them. They charge a truckload of money. I'm a little bit like, sometimes it's valuable, and geez, I'm probably not going to have them on now. And I had the North America CEO of McKinsey on about 15 months ago. But sometimes I think it's not as valuable as the price you're paying. Does it really depend, I guess, really on the consultant and your interaction and relationship with him or her?
I've got a very different point of view on consulting. It can be very, very effective, but I think it has to be targeted. And I tease my consulting friends. I say, you walk into a company, sit down with the CEO and say, what can I do for you? You may get hired, but it's not going to be a very effective relationship, because that CEO probably doesn't know what he needs or she needs. And so a better way to do it is to do some research on the company, come in with a very targeted solution and say, based on the research we've already done, we think we could help you in this very specifically defined area. That, I think, can be an effective use of consulting. So it may be, we talked about supply chain. They may come in and say, look, we've done a lot of work on supply chain, and we can take your retail chain from once a week delivery to 5 days a week, and we can save you money. Yeah, I'd hire them on that basis, because they've probably got a skill set that I don't have. But to hire a consulting firm and say, gee, you should help us with our strategy, and a very open-ended engagement, I think is a disservice to both your organization and to the consulting firm, because that's probably not going to come out with the desired result.
We'll switch over a little bit, and I get it. This was 10 to 15 years before your time there. But Blockbuster is commonly used, including by me, as examples of what might have went wrong with kind of pre-internet into the internet and the advancement of technology, digital, Web 2. We all give the example. Blockbuster was this great, gigantic company, and now most 25-year-olds would have no idea who they were. They became irrelevant, and things changed radically. Netflix came along, probably wasn't even on Blockbuster's radar when they were probably starting to get some early traction. So we'll get a little bit more to your tenure and the interaction there, but maybe let's broadly talk about companies like a Blockbuster back in the 90s getting blindsided. How do large companies that are a little bit bureaucratic, that don't necessarily create and move quickly, how do they stay abreast of the times that are changing and that they don't get what happened to Netflix effectively eating Blockbuster?
Yeah. Well, we're going to come back to that, because Netflix didn't eat Blockbuster. I'll share with you why, the real story, which is seldom told. But I'll go back to 7-Eleven as an example. 7-Eleven was bankrupt in 1991, and people forget that. They almost went away. I remember the street saying at the time, I was chief financial officer coming right out of bankruptcy for 7-Eleven, and the street used to say, hey, you guys are irrelevant. Everybody's open 24 hours now. You sell beer, cigarettes, and soft drinks. Everything you sell is dying category. You're not relevant. It was like, wait. And literally, we took to heart the idea that we had lost sight of our true function. Our true function was convenience. And that wasn't about selling beer or cigarettes. It was about selling convenience. And the Japanese had figured it out with fresh sushi. They had taken fresh foods to the next level and made it more convenient to get high quality product. We then started doing things like put ATMs in every store, sell prepaid phone cards back in the day when, that was a real convenience item. So what we created internally is a culture of intellectual curiosity. And this is what's missing in so many companies, that they stop being curious, right? And by intellectual curiosity, I mean, I wanted every one of our team members to be constantly looking for what's new. What can I bring to market in a more convenient fashion than someone else? And it might be, a new soft drink. It might be a new energy drink. It might be a new snack, or, being ahead of the keto diet craze, whatever it is, but constantly being obsessed with new and how to bring that into the system. That's where a lot of companies fail, and that's what people accuse Blockbuster of doing, that they didn't see digital technology coming. Not at all true.
So then you mentioned a little bit of, I use the verbiage, Netflix, quote unquote, eating up Blockbuster. You led into why that may not necessarily be the perfect analogy and wasn't totally true, but obviously, and before your time, we'll get to your tenure shortly, Netflix succeeded where Blockbuster apparently didn't. What did Blockbuster do wrong?
Blockbuster, there are a couple of decisions, and I'm going to take the responsibility, because when I got there, Blockbuster was doing DVDs by mail to compete with Netflix.
Right.
But I didn't see that as the next digital, the technology transition to digital. Some people did. And we've taken a little bit of heat because we didn't stay in the subscriber battle with Netflix, but subscription is only a piece of the digital experience. So what we were after is a broader experience. We wanted to be the aggregator of content, just like the stores were. And subscription content was mostly at the time long tail. People weren't developing new TV shows like we do now, Yellowstone or House of Cards or things like that. That was an evolution that came much, much later. But when we evolved to digital, we wanted to have that same breadth of experience. New releases available. If I want a subscription of older long tail content for the kids, I can have it. But to be that aggregator that really doesn't exist today. Netflix doesn't do that. No one actually does that today very effectively.
Interesting point. So, okay, that takes us to your role as CEO and chairman, which I believe began in 2007. How did you come, which I believe is an interesting story, how did you come into Blockbuster?
Yeah, that actually is, there's a lot more to the story. I won't get the whole detail, but after leaving 7-Eleven, I realized the power of technology, the power of bridging physical brick and mortar stores, which is what we did with Blockbuster, with technology solutions. And I looked at the landscape and I said, who's got that opportunity? And one that came to mind was Radio Shack. And Radio Shack could have been and should have been. I used to call it the Apple Store for everyman, because Apple had just created the Apple Store and Radio Shack was still selling, wires and, parts to make your own computer. And they started selling phones. Literally, they chose not to sell the iPhone when it first came out because the margins were too small. Because wow. their margins, I know it's hard to even imagine, their margins on the bits and pieces that they would sell to the electronics audience, like 50-60%, and an iPhone was a small margin percentage, even though the sales were huge. So they were selling other phones and other things. Long history of opportunity, I think, missed with Radio Shack. So I saw that as an interesting opportunity. And then I saw Blockbuster and a similar opportunity. And Radio Shack was selling hardware. Blockbuster was selling software. I thought, if I get into one and get it straightened out and then bang the two together, I'll have hardware and software in virtually every phone or every computer you would sell with Blockbuster On Demand loaded inside. It'd be like the ultimate Apple store that was technology agnostic. So I didn't have to have an iPhone, an iWatch, and a Mac. I got to have a Sony TV and a Dell computer and a BlackBerry at the time, and I could still access my favorite content. That was the original vision. So I started on a roadshow trying to take one of those two companies private, and ran into Carl Icahn, who was an investor. I was actually in an investor meeting and got picked up the phone and called Carl and said, "You got to hear this." And 20 minutes later, I was in Carl's office and he said, "All right, come on, let's do this." Mistake number one, there's some things I would do again. I believe it would have been a successful and could have been a more successful strategy to take Blockbuster private, do all of the re-engineering we needed to do, and then reemerge as a public company with a digital presence. Carl convinced me, leave it public, it's fine. But you think of the timing, this was 2007.
Yeah.
$1 billion of debt, a third of it due in 2009.
Wow.
Yeah. And so had we taken it private in 2007, would have refinanced the debt, probably had a 10-year term on the debt. We would have blown through the financial crisis, never batted an eyelash.
Yeah, it's amazing how just sometimes one decision or one key decision like that really changes everything. So I'm assuming he was a significant shareholder and then became active in the debt of the company.
Yeah.
And obviously major influence from the board perspective, et cetera. Yeah, that was probably something that didn't play out too well. What was a valuable lesson learned from such an iconic investor like Carl that maybe we could all learn and move forward with today?
Well, Carl is a very sophisticated investor, and he was actually he was a little bit of a challenge as a board member, but because he's
he might be a little hands-on.
A little hands-on, the 10, 11 o'clock at night phone calls that last an hour, but he was.
I like that.
Actually, it was kind of interesting. He was actually very supportive of our initiative because he believed that that when he buys into a company, he believes in the opportunity to transform it. So he was very supportive in the first 2 years of what we were trying to do. In fact, very first thing out of the gates, 2007, I got there. I was there for 3 months. We bought a company called MovieLink, which was a streaming video company. This defies all of those, rumors that Blockbuster didn't do anything, didn't keep up with technology, didn't see digital coming. 2007, no one was streaming. It was, kids with their Xbox, basically. And we bought a company called MovieLink, which was created by the studios to be able to stream with their cooperation and support. Carl was very much supportive of that, very much supportive of our technology strategy to take it to the next level. Also recognized the importance of cash flow. So we had that delicate balance of make the stores more productive in the short term and then reinvest that positive cash flow into digital for the future. But I'll give you another. I brought a little show and tell. I actually saw this in my office and said, I got to show him this.
Wow.
So this was the commemorative little tombstone thing it says commemorating the launch of Blockbuster On Demand with two-wire media point and digital media player. This was a launch and it says November 2008. The reason I showed you that is that November 2008 was critical timing. We had just reported 3/4 of earnings, almost doubled EBITDA, got a 2-notch upgrade from Moody's in our debt rating, now positioned to be able to refinance the debt, which was very important. So I didn't push it off to 2009. But remember what happened in November of 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed.
Yes.
So just as we launched Blockbuster On Demand to be able to compete effectively, Netflix was still primarily doing DVDs by mail and had just been introducing and playing with Roku as a device.
Yes, I remember.
They had very old content, a bunch of old movies. We had access to new movies, new releases, and old movies, older movies. And so we thought Blockbuster On Demand could be quite competitive. But in 2008, even when we doubled EBITDA and even when we got a 2-notch debt upgrade, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, Moody's cautioned that we might be a liquidity risk because of our inability to refinance the debt in 2009. That created a whole series of cards, dominoes falling, that caused Carl then to say, you know what, financial markets are collapsing. Why don't we just let this thing go? We'll file it and reemerge as a digital entity down the road. Well, what we had it, and he sold his equity and ended up buying the debt. So now he wasn't an insider any longer. But meanwhile, what Carl wasn't an insider too is we had discussions with Google, We had really productive discussions with dish networks, other telecom companies that would help accelerate our transition into digital. And a strategic play was a far better solution, at least I thought, than liquidating the company. So that was the path we went. We ended up filing bankruptcy. Carl wanted to buy it and liquidate it, and then restart down the road as a different entity with digital. What we wanted to do was find a strategic partner, and Dish at the time we thought would be an ideal strategic partner.
So to this day, Dish Network is the owner of the brand, the IP, I guess I would call it, a Blockbuster.
Exactly. Now their strategy actually was quite good. They planned to bypass the internet and go straight to mobility. Dish had been quietly buying up spectrum because they knew 5G was coming, and that the internet at the time was still pretty clunky in 2008.
Yeah, it's true.
With 5G or with accelerated bandwidth in mobility, download a movie to any device quickly and upload it to the TV would be a much better experience than streaming on the internet with buffering and all the other issues we faced at the time.
And so, and we're a little bit crunched for time. We have a couple of things to get to, but maybe a quick response on that. What kind of went wrong with that?
Well, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but with technology, you run into three different buckets. You've got government, you've got business, and you've got science, the technology behind it, right? And in that case, the science was there. The business was willing. The government said, no, we're not ready to release the spectrum. We're not ready to release 5G capability. So even today, government still, just last week, we postponed an expansion of 5G because of the interference with airports and flight controls in airport vicinities. So we're even now, this is what, 10 years later, just now getting to 5G, and that's primarily a governmental regulation issue.
Yep. Yeah, unfortunately, that did play a lot into it. So, I mean, we mentioned, and I mentioned to you as you've been active in how things are changing, Web3, crypto, blockchain, and DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. What, about a week ago, it was announced a DAO being raised, I believe, called the Blockbuster DAO, wanting to buy, I guess you could say, the IP of Blockbuster and have Netflix shaking in their boots. You never know, like, who knows? So I forgot what it was they raised, but I find DAOs to be incredibly interesting. So speaking of governance structure and new way moving forward and how it maybe is a challenge to even the VC model, I find DAOs to be incredibly intriguing. So what was it, maybe 5 million, which is, I'm assuming, not enough capital to buy the IP, but the concept of it is intriguing. What do you think of DAOs being impactful to governance and business structures moving forward? I mean, I don't think they're going to go away.
Yeah, no, I think DAOs, I'll compare DAOs to SPACs, right? It's just another form of raising capital to go out to make investments, right? And I think DAOs will have a place. I think in nonprofit world, where governance isn't as critical, information isn't as important or important to the day-to-day operation, I think DAOs can be very successful. And in some industries, I think DAOs can be successful. Here's the challenge, I think, when it comes to technology industry. The old days, yesterday, let's say 2020 till this year, the industry rewarded generalists. There were very low barriers to entry to a lot of these technology solutions. And Silicon Valley was prominent, et cetera, et cetera. If you look forward into where technology is going, we're, I think, entering a period now where there's a lot more specialization needed. If you look at future space involvement, for example, this is highly technical stuff. And the need for data and the need for specialists and technology specialists, I think, runs a little inconsistently with a DAO that is more of consensus, you know? So how do you translate, let's say a DAO was investing in SpaceX. SpaceX is going to have some ups and downs in terms of its actual performance. So how do you translate that into an investor being willing to stay with it on the basis of facts and data as opposed to emotion because it feels good? So in other words, you don't want an environment where you've got a GameStop kind of investor base that is ebbing and flowing based on the emotion of the time as opposed to the actual facts of the performance of the company. And I think that's a vulnerability, a little bit of a vulnerability of the DAO.
And in terms of what you're doing now, and I'm looking back at, the subtitle, Embracing Change Through Technology, and again, the position upcoming of Executive Chairman of C5 Capital Holdings, and interest in new space, cybersecurity, clean energy. I'm giving you a lot to cover to kind of recap as we begin to conclude in the final couple of minutes, but I will kick it off to you and love to hear what you have to say.
Well, I've been spending a lot of time working on individual opportunities. I do a lot of work with NASA and some of the former astronauts, and got involved with a project for laser communications, which was very, very relevant to Blockbuster, because imagine if you can move data at the speed of light versus the speed of sound using satellite constellation. It's coming. And if you think 5G will change the world, you'd go to 10G or 20G in terms of the speed and bandwidth capability with laser communications. So that's probably only 20 years away. That with Jeff Bezos' work and Elon Musk's work in building, for example, the SkyTrain and creating the constellation of satellites, that we'll get there with laser communications. So I'm working on these individual bits and pieces, and I realized, you know what, there's a massive opportunity in this new technology world, and yet I'm looking at individual companies. I was attracted to C5 Capital because they've got the right perspective, I think, in the need to pull business, science, and government together and create these collaborations to accelerate technology. Look at what happened with COVID. When business and government and science came together, we were able to create a vaccine in 6 months, and that could have taken 20 years. So if you apply that same focus, and we can bring investors together to support the space infrastructure, we tend to focus on SpaceX or Blue Origin. There's a whole infrastructure being spawned to be able to repair satellites, to be able to provide for the next space station, which one of the portfolio companies called Axiom is doing now. All of these opportunities need that collaboration between government, the science, and the investment community. And that's what we're hoping to be able to bring. So particularly in new space, so that all of the initiatives around space infrastructure, but also new energy. We sort of stumbled into the idea that spacecraft are being fueled by hydrogen traditionally, but nuclear is a much, much more practical solution for the long term. It'll exponentially reduce the time for travel to Mars. And it is possible, believe it or not, the technology exists today. We use it in submarines all the time. So we can actually harness the power of nuclear. And then if you take that in a terrestrial solution, it's the ultimate form of green energy. So again, you run into regulatory issues, investor concerns, fears, what's the time frame, et cetera. We think we can accelerate both new space and new energy by as much as 10 or 20 years by trying to corral these, government, science, and business interests and focus them on the solutions for both of those two areas.
It sounds like over the next, obviously, day, year, years, decade, 2 decades, will be like amazing advancements that are happening exponentially, from what you mentioned in terms of a clean energy initiative to Elon and others in terms of what they're doing on Starlink and satellites and laser, like you said, and really the promise of what could be what we now define as the metaverse, but we don't quite have like the horsepower yet But like you said, we go from 5G to like effectively 10G or 20G, maybe even sooner than what you're thinking. Coupled with how everything else is advancing, I mean, our world, you could argue good or bad, could look a lot different for many of us just a couple of years out, which maybe brings the question, which relates to the earlier discussion we had about adapting, is like, how do we adapt? What would you recommend to those in college or graduating now, to maybe those that are in their 30s or 40s in a career where maybe, I don't know, AI, quantum, and others could be a threat to what they're currently doing, and they'll need to adapt. I could go into other issues on how are people going to be employed? Is that going to be a burden on the government? Could there be an uprising of people? Will the government have to have universal base income, provide housing? We could save that discussion for a different time that gets very political and very complex. But the bigger picture is, what would you recommend to someone in college now and someone still relatively early in their career, that what they're doing now is probably going to look a hell of a lot different for all the reasons I noted in the coming years?
Well, I'm literally working. I've been working. This started during COVID. I started with a little extra time working on a book, and it's with a publisher now. I'm shopping with publishers, but it's called "Education is Freedom," and in that book, it addresses that very issue. If people ask me all the time, what would you say to your 20-year-old self to deal with these, emerging technologies and change that we're confronting in society? And literally the idea of the book is that education is freedom, and it's a self-help guide for humanity, because all of us are in charge of our own destiny. And if we can learn as much as we can, and you think of the power today, you and I learned with books in school and a very structured curriculum, you can learn virtually anything you want from, one of these devices now, in any subject yourself. And so we're right on the cusp of having the ability to grow individually into any area we want. So my advice to young people today, or to anybody actually, is learn and open your heart and mind to intellectual curiosity, which is the key to all learning, and let yourself grow, and don't be constrained with a fear of change. There's nothing to fear. It's all upside, all opportunity.
I mean, you have an opportunity to be an optimist or a pessimist. I think I would rather be the optimist. I think there's a saying, I'm probably going to mess it up a little bit, pessimist look smart, optimist make money, something like that. Now, of course, don't take it too literal, but from a figurative perspective, I make up my own words there. Yeah, I mean, to me, entrepreneurs are people that have a grand vision and they push through and they make things happen. They're optimists, they're incredible believers. Are they often a little bit delusional? The answer is yes, they are. They're
Sure.
obsessed. I think they have to be someone like an Elon Musk, to be someone who thinks that big. Well, so many things we could talk about, and it sounds like maybe part 2 of our dialogue in a couple of months will be more focused on what you're now doing at C5 and new space, cybersecurity, and clean energy. So we'll perhaps call this a part 1. For those that have an interest in learning more about you, Jim, and I know there's still maybe the transition to what you're doing at C5. I don't know if there's a website, a personal website, how people can maybe communicate with you. Is there anything you would recommend?
Sure. I do have a website at jameskeys.com. I've got a email, keys.james.w@gmail.com. And I have a C5 email now, james.keys@c5capital.com. Letter C5 capital.com. So any of those ways, or I'm on LinkedIn as well. So I welcome anybody to reach out and continue the dialogue, and look forward to part 2.
Yeah, thank you. And generally, I do find social media like LinkedIn to actually be great vehicles to connect with someone, look at some of their content and insight, and to internally DM them and connect with them. And that's Jim Keys, and Keys spelled Keyes, everyone. So I highly encourage reaching out to Jim, introducing yourself, being at least a follow at minimum on LinkedIn. And, with his transition to executive chairman at C5, it sounds like they're doing very intriguing things. So in a couple of months, we'll catch up with Jim again and kind of do what I'm going to call the part two. Well, I hope you all enjoyed it, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, host of the Angelo Robles podcast, founder at Family Office Association. Check us out, become a member, get access to all we offer and the in-person and digital programs and other master classes and handbooks and connectivity that Family Office Association provides at familyofficeassociation.com. You could reach out to me also via social media. I'm active on all platforms, probably most active. Most people would know me as Family Office on YouTube because of my interviews and videos. Angelo Robles Meta on Instagram, where I'm active a little bit more personally, and what I'm doing in the world of crypto, NFTs, and the metaverse for those that are interested. So have a chance to connect, reach out. I look forward to it. Happy New Year to everyone. This is one of our first interviews back from the new year. We hope you enjoyed it. And Jim, it's a pleasure to connect, to meet you. I really learned a lot and look forward to our part two.
Thank you, Angelo. Enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.